All right. The second general claim that the liberal dream tradition makes about how and why the market is a moral thing and gets us to act in moral ways is that commerce fosters cooperation. Markets get us to interact with others in ways that we wouldn't if we had a different kind of economic system. So, markets allow us to cooperate with one another. And the way that this is often put, particularly within the Austrian School of Economics, is that with markets, you get cooperation or social coordination without coercion. All right. So, for example, let's say I want to go and have my favorite meal, which is the nachos from Tanya's here in Gettysburg. And if you haven't had them, they're fantastic. But I try to limit myself to eating them only once or twice a year because there's no way that they can be good for you. But they're super good for the soul and probably not the best in terms of health. So it's my favorite, but I don't try to have it that often. But nevertheless, let's say today's a special day. I want to go have those nachos. Think of all the work that has to go into it, all the amount of social coordination involved in making it so I can go to this one restaurant and get this wonderful meal. If nothing else, the people at Tanya's have to be there so they can run the store and then also cook the food and prepare the food. Then they also, the folks at Tanya's then are dependent on all their suppliers, right, to get them the raw materials needed to cook this meal. Those suppliers are probably acting with other suppliers, right? And so they need those suppliers to supply them with certain things. That second tier suppliers probably need to work with people that are actually producing the food and the elements that go into it. So the people that grow the corn, people who grow the beans, people who grow the jalapenos, right? And those places, those establishments probably have lots of people working for them. So this very simple act of going and buying nachos entails a large amount of social coordination, all of which, at least in theory, is done without coercion, right? These people are working and doing certain things because they are more or less freely choosing to do so. And they're not doing it because someone's holding a gun to their head and saying, you have to do this. And what the liberal dream folks want to point out is, all right, just this one example is emblematic of all economic relationships where people are freely choosing to do things. There's high levels of social coordination, there's high levels of social order, but it's all being done without coercion. So the market promotes coordination, cooperation without the involvement of coercion, at least in theory. And this is for a couple of reasons. So on the one hand, markets make us interdependent on others, and this can reduce social tensions. And this tends to be true both on an individual level and also a social one. If we are interdependent upon other people, right, we need them to fulfill our wants and desires. So if I want to get something done, I'm relying on this other person. And the fact that we are mutually reliant upon another, right, compels us to cooperate in ways that does not involve the use of force or coercion. I think this is actually easier to see on a social level, where Foucault and Healy talk about this in terms of how being accepted into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is seen as a sign that these are countries that can cooperate with others in more or less friendly ways, right? They're cooperating with each other through trade, as opposed to by means of coercion. Another way that this can be expressed that Foucault and Healy didn't talk about, but it comes up in some other areas of study, is what's referred to as Friedman's Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. And the general claim that Friedman makes is that no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other since opening their McDonald's. Now, there's one caveat here at least one caveat that I know, which is in the case of Yugoslavia. That was a case where two countries did have McDonald's and went to war after they had their McDonald's. And in theory, there could be a couple. It's possible there might be a few other exceptions now. But as a general rule, Friedman is right. Once countries have McDonald's, they tend not to go to war with one another. And why is this? Well, there tends to be two things. On the one hand, if you have McDonald's, that probably implies that you have a middle class. And if you have a middle class, that's a big group of people who would have a lot to lose if their country were to go to war. And so the population in a country is going to be really reluctant to go to war if they are middle class, and will only do so if it's extremely necessary, if there's some sort of existential threat. Otherwise, it's not worth going to war. Economically, it's not worth going to war. Also, if you have a McDonald's, that means you are part of kind of the global economic system. You're embedded within the global economic system. And because of that, there's an incentive then to cooperate, at least on the surface, and at least make it look like you're cooperating with other countries, and you're not doing things like trying to go to war with them, trying to invade them, trying to take them over and stuff like that. And one area where you can see this, right, is that two countries that the U.S. has tensions with right now, right, one of which is China. China is a growing superpower. They're trying to flex their muscles, and by moving into some areas that the U.S. saw as like historically being under their control. All right. So the U.S. and China are competing for the same things, right? They both want to be the global superpower. And they have different interests, and those interests are antithetical to one another, right? Because what China gains, the U.S. loses. What the U.S. gains, China loses in general. But the odds of these two countries going to war is pretty minimal, because right now we're very economically dependent upon China, and they're very economically dependent upon us. All right. So we have too much economic interdependence for going to war to make sense, right? Now there might be hostile trade negotiations, right? There can be situations where one country will do something to another one to get kind of like flex its muscles and those kind of things. So there might be lower level or small stakes conflicts going on, but it probably won't ever get to a situation of full scale war. Economically, it just doesn't make sense. All right, another country that the U.S. Has tensions with is North Korea. And if you know anything about North Korea, their goal is to be economically independent. So they're trying to do everything they can to not have really strong ties to other countries. And this is why they're referred to as the Hermit Kingdom, because so much of their activity is spent on just being North Korea and controlling what goes on inside of its borders, and not trying to do other things and have economic dependency upon other nations. The risk of war with North Korea, in terms of the U.S., I think is a lot higher, in large part because North Korea isn't economically dependent upon us. And so if you know anything about North Korea, they're known as the Hermit Kingdom, and they're known as this because largely they try to be economically independent, right? So they're trying to produce all the goods and services they need within their own territory. So they're not linked up to the global economic system. And so because they're relatively economic independent, right? From an economic point of view, they don't have the same incentives in order to prevent them from going to war, say, with America, right? Because their economic fortunes aren't similarly bound to what goes on in the U.S. And the same thing, the U.S. doesn't have its economic fortune isn't really tied to what goes on in North Korea. All right. So there is a fair amount of evidence to show that, again, the personal level and the social level, that markets do tend to promote cooperation between parties. All right. Another way in which markets or commerce tends to foster cooperation is how it tends to make us be other regarding, or as Foucault and Healy put it, it tends to promote a shared intersubjective orientation, which basically means I'm trying to imagine what's going inside of the heads of other people. And the reason why markets can do this and kind of induce this way of thinking is if I want to make a lot of money, right? Then I need to be able to provide goods and services that other people are going to want and are willing to spend money on. And to know what people want and what they're willing to spend money on, I need to understand the world from their terms, not necessarily from my terms, right? I might like particular things, and some of the particular things I like, maybe lots of other people like them also. But some of the things I like could just be really unique to me, or it could be a very niche thing. Um, but if my goal is to be in business and to cater to as wide a variety of people as possible, uh, or even just to a particular clientele, I need to understand how they understand the world. So the market uh, induces in me this shared intersubjective orientation. I want to understand how other people understand the world, what other wants and desires they have, so we can provide goods and services that meet their desires and meet their demands. Now, I think I said previously I would not be a good capitalist because if I got a certain amount of money, all right, I'm just going to take my money and go buy my private island and just hang out there. Where I should really take that money and kind of put it back into a business and make it more and more successful, I'm going to check out. I'm probably also not the greatest capitalist in the world because I have a hard time understanding certain products that exist in the market, and I would never even think about trying to offer particular products that often prove to be quite successful. So a few years back, my son became obsessed with phone cases, and he always wanted a different phone case. Like every week, it was like he needed a new phone case. And I mean, I have a cell phone. For each of the cell phones I've had, I have a case. I buy one case. I buy the case that is the most offers the most protection and the least prone to being destroyed, and I stick with that for the entire life of my phone, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, however long I have that phone. I've got one case. It's good to go. For me, a phone case is something you buy once and you go with it. My son, however, and I gather lots of other people at the time, saw phone cases as like a fashion accessory. And so things that you would change out, depending on a variety of different things. And I mean, I saw there was a market for this because we go to the mall and there would be the phone case, little kiosks up around, and there was generally people there buying phone cases. Um, I just don't, I, I will confess, I don't understand that and why you would change your phone case other than unless you had to because you're broke. So I probably wouldn't be a good capitalist. And I wouldn't be a good capitalist because, in this sense, I'm not being other regarding. I'm just thinking in terms of my personal perspective. If I want to go into business, I need to flip that. What I should care about is how other people understand the world. What do they want? What do they like? What are they willing to spend their money on? And if that aligns with my preferences, great. If it doesn't matter. Right? My goal is to cater to the market, to be other regarding. All right, another aspect of this, in terms of how commerce can foster cooperation in some neat and interesting ways, starts with the point that Foucault and Healy make, which is that given the choice, people prefer gift-like exchanges as opposed to just kind of like anonymous market transactions. Uh, so we, again, kind of value things like the exchange of presents at holidays more so than going out and buying something just off of eBay or Amazon, right? Those gift-like exchanges are more meaningful to us than opposed to just shopping on Amazon or eBay or somewhere else, all right? Buying something off of Craigslist. That being said, it's hard to have gift-like exchanges on a large social scale. Now, we'll see some historical examples of this where it can work under certain circumstances, but in the US, with 330 million people, trying to organize everything around gift exchanges would be virtually impossible. So there does need to be a market, and that means that most of people's transactions take place through the market. So something that they generally prefer less as opposed to gift-like exchanges. But people do something to cope with the situation. So the market tends to compel us to act in a way of exchanging that we prefer less than another form. Gift-like exchanges is number one. Economic transactions through the market are two. But we often do things to economic transactions to move them back into looking something more like gift-like exchanges, or at least trying to personalize what in theory could be anonymous transactions. And this is how people tend to personalize economic relationships. And this personalization tends to build trust, tends to build familiarity, and has lots of benefits that go along with it. But you might have seen examples of this, like if there is a local restaurant in town that you've been going to for years, you might come to get to know the people that work at that restaurant, or maybe the owner, or maybe there's a waiter or waitress that's been working there for a decade, and you might know this person and these people really well, and you're not just interacting with them as you would, say, a stranger, just this abstract person, right? You're interacting with this person with someone you know, right? They know that when you order this thing, you don't like when you order a salad, you want your dressing on the side as opposed to being put on top. And so you essentially have an economic relationship that's also infused with a social relationship. And it's not just purely this anonymous exchange, but again, the personal and the economic are overlapping with one another. And one effect of this is that when people do have these personalized economic relationships, these are relationships in which trust tends to be built between the two parties. And that limits the chance that one party is going to try to economically exploit the other one. Right? So if you've been going to the same car mechanic for a long time, and you know this person really well, and every time you go in, you talk to the mechanic, right? You know that this mechanic has kids, and so you inquire about their kids, and they ask you about your dog, right? And you have this personal relationship, even in this economic context. The likelihood that this car mechanic would rip you off, even if he or she could, is lower because trust has been built up in this personal relationship. All right. And given that happens in many different contexts, and personal relationships overlapping economic ones, is another way in which commerce tends to foster cooperation. All right. In the next part of the lecture, we'll talk about the final two general claims that the liberal dream makes regarding why markets are morally good and make us act well.